Welcome to the BLOCS. What you need to know: diversity and equity as a foundation series. We have Nubia Bennett, who has joined us from the University of Louisville. Today's session is going to be on anti-racism. So I am grateful that everybody is jumping on and coming on in the room. Thank you all for joining. My name is Felicia Williams-Young. I serve as the Senior Manager for Education, Training, and Program Development at Metro United Way. I have some colleagues on the call, as well as all of you who are popping on. I do have 3 announcements before I hand it over to Nubia. The first announcement is we have 3 trainings coming up fast and furiously over the next 30 days. So if you have a pen, if you can write down these dates. So April the 7th, we have our next methods training. And for that methods training, the topic of that one is, I probably should know this, but it is youth voice. So April the 7th at 10 a.m. from 10 to noon, we have youth work methods, and the topic is youth voice. The second is our April Communities of Practice, which is April the 8th from 10 a.m. to noon. And that is, we have some folks who are coming to talk about some cool things that they're doing in their program, how they're planning for summer, all of those kind of things. So join us for the BLOCS Communities of Practice. And on April the 15th, we have NCFL coming. They're going to be talking about family engagement, how to recruit, how to use family engagement as a recruiting tool, how to, start recruiting for the summer and building a family engagement. So all of these will come on an email that's coming out to you next Wednesday, March the 24th. So the invitation for all 3 of these will be on the same email. So it's read the email, click on the registration button for any and all that you plan to attend. We want to see each and every one of you at those training sessions. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Nubia Bennett from the University of Louisville. She's going to tell you about herself, and she will start the training now. Thanks, Nubia.
Thank you, Felicia. And you made me a host already so I could share my screen and everything. Okay. All right. Is this where we are? This is where we are. Me and technology. So much fun. So Sam, to make sure we're good there. And you guys can see what I see, right? You see anti-racism? Is that what it says? Okay. I like to make sure. I don't want to get started without making sure I'm good with the technology, because that's always the challenge. I'm old school. Well, hello everyone. I'm super excited to be back with BLOCS training. It was not a year and a half ago. I was actually among each of you for methods training because youth development is near and dear to my heart. In fact, most of my anti-racism work that I'm doing here at U of L currently, all of it really is based in a social justice youth development framework. A little bit about me. I am born and raised here in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm homegrown completely. I've been around U of L actually. I've only been at U of L it'll be about 6 months soon. But I've been born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky. I have 2 degrees from U of L. So my undergraduate is in communications with a minor in Pan-African Studies, go figure. And my master's is in college student personnel, counseling, personnel services. So higher ed. I'm actually currently working on another one because school is free, and who doesn't like free schooling when you work at the university in policy and equity, because anti-racism is my gig, right? So I'm the program coordinator for diversity, education, and inclusive excellence. So my job is to do exactly what I'm doing here. Promote uncomfortable conversations around race, racism, privilege, microaggressions, implicit bias. And for those of you who were at our last month's training, we were here with you all last month, and we did a training on implicit bias with my colleague, Marian Vasser. She's the greatest. So she left me with some big shoes to fill, because I enjoy that presentation every single time she does it. So I'm super excited to be here with you all, because like I said, I used to be with you all, like, was it twice a month, Felicia? Twice a month, had training. It was probably one of the better trainings of my day. Like, I enjoyed going to those trainings. I worked for Louisville Metro. So I was working with youth development there, doing civic engagement work, civic education work. So I managed the youth implementation team, which used to be a advisory council to Mayor Fisher on violence prevention, but it was all youth. So youth development, youth empowerment, and just education is just kind of what I enjoy doing. I would like, while I'm introducing myself, I would like to kind of know who all is here. So if you could put your name, just kind of say who you are, and what organizations are represented. I will get around to looking at some of that, because I see some familiar faces and names, but it's been a while. So if you could just drop in the chat, that would be really cool, just so I know who is around and who is in the audience. So today, let me go ahead and get started. Slideshow gets off. All right. So today's presentation or conversation, I'd like to say, is going to be about anti-racism. What does that even mean? One of my favorite quotes is provocative. It gets the people going, because it's literally everywhere. So in a Brown school 10 years ago. Oh, see, I'll get distracted. I'm gonna look at the chat in a minute. But so we're going to talk about this. We're going to break this down a little bit more so that we kind of have a shared understanding, because really what these presentations are really gets everybody started from where they are, because we could have 2-hour presentations every single day for the next year, and we would not cover everything. We would not know everything we need to know about anti-racism. I'm still learning, and I do this work every day. So today's presentation is really meant to be a conversation. So please, please, please don't make me feel like I'm talking to myself. If you feel more comfortable being in the chat, definitely keep that conversation going in the chat. Also, feel free to have a conversation with me. Unmute, say, hey, I got some things I want to say. Please do that, because I think that makes for fruitful conversation. Because as much as I like to think that I know, I think we all have something to add to this conversation if we're all going to do this work together. That being said, I do have just 3 things that I want to make sure we walk away from. I like to tell everybody I have a few slides. I'm not married to these slides. I know what I want to cover. So if we do have fruitful conversation, I don't mind taking a left here, because I know that we'll cover everything we need to cover in the time that we have. I think that in this work, the work comes from what's generative comes from conversation. But the 3 things that I do hope that you walk away from this conversation, or at least get up from your computer with, is a shared understanding of the critical terms and anti-racism, especially that we examine the ways concepts manifest in, through, and around us daily, and then explore some questions designed to inform and inform action, because it's all fun and dandy to walk away from there like, oh, I feel good. We talked about racism. We talked about anti-racism. I feel good. But we really haven't done any work if we're not informing our actions, right? So the way I think about it is like this. Myself and my colleague do about 300 or so of these presentations a year. So that's almost a presentation a day, not including weekends. That's almost one presentation a day, which we often do more than that, right? That's us doing the work, right? Because we're doing that, and you doing the work of moving from racist to anti-racist is work for you, right? But even if we split this up and we did 300 workshops a piece, that's 600 workshops for a year a piece. There's no way we're reaching everybody. So this is collective impact in that I'm sharing with you, I'm doing this work with you today. Hopefully there is something you take from this conversation that you can continue this conversation courageously wherever else you go, right? So then we're all doing this work together. And I know a lot of you all work at spaces where there are young people there, where there is staff there. So continuing these conversations in your respective spaces is all of us continuing to do the work. That's why all of this work is to inform action. So that being said, the way this presentation is set up is I have a lot of information really just to give us a foundation so that we're all having the same conversation. And then, of course, feel free to add to the conversation during it. This question and answer is throughout. There is a question and answer section, but it's really throughout the entire presentation. But at the end of the day, I mean, I'm not going to be presenting to you all for straight 2 hours because y'all going to walk away with a headache, and I will too. So I'll talk for a bit. I'll present the information so that we have a shared foundation. And then I really just want to have a conversation, because that's actually what I miss about coming to trainings, right? Having conversation about what we all know and what we experience. So that's how you get the most out of these conversations, is how does this impact me in the work that I'm doing every single day? All right, so we can go ahead and actually for real get started. I do like to set it up. So I'm going to start off with a video to kind of set the stage for anti-racism. Now let's just make sure this works today. Is it going to work for me? And if it doesn't, I have a YouTube. I knew it was going to do that. It freezes. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop sharing for a second.
So I've been seeing a lot of things talking about people making commentary. Interestingly enough, the ones I've noticed that have been making the commentary are wealthy Black people, making the commentary about, we should not be rioting, we should not be looting, we should not be tearing up our own communities. And then there's been an argument of the other side of we should be hitting them in the pocket. We should be focusing on the blackout days where we don't spend money. But, you know, I feel like we should do both. And I feel like I support both. And I'll tell you why I support both. I support both because when you have a civil unrest like this, there are three types of people in the streets. There are the protesters, there are the rioters, and there are the looters. The protesters are there because they actually care about what is happening in the community. They want to raise their voices, and they are there strictly to protest. You have the rioters who are angry, who are anarchists, who really just want to shit up, and that's what they're going to do regardless. And then you have the looters. And the looters almost exclusively are just there to do that, to loot. Now, people are like, well, what did you gain? Well, what did you get from looting? I think that as long as we're focusing on the what, we're not focusing on the why, and that's my issue with that. As long as we're focusing on what they're doing, we're not focusing on why they're doing. And some people are like, well, those aren't people who are legitimately angry about what's happening. Those are people who just want to get stuff. Okay, well then, let's go with that. Let's say that's what it is. Let's ask ourselves why in this country in 2020, the financial gap between poor Blacks and the rest of the world is at such a distance that people feel like their only hope and only opportunity to get some of the things that we flaunt and flash in front of them all the time is to walk through a broken glass window and get it. That they are so hopeless that getting that necklace, getting that TV, getting that change, getting that bed, getting that phone, whatever it is that they're gonna get, is that in that moment when the riots happen and if they present an opportunity of looting, that's their only opportunity to get it. We need to be questioning that why. Why are people that poor? Why are people that broke? Why are people that food insecure, that clothing insecure, that they feel like their only shot that they are shooting their shot by walking through a broken glass window to get what they need. And then people want to talk about, well, there's plenty of people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and got it on their own. Why can't they do that? Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity to spend time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that Black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything. And then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa, that was Rosewood. Those are places where we built Black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. So that's 450 years. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So then for 50 years, you finally get a little bit and you're allowed to play. And every time that they don't like the way that you're playing, or that you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. They burn your cards. They burn your Monopoly money. And then finally at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now at this point, the only way you're gonna catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But what if every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood, how can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the f do I give a shit about burning the Football Hall of Fame, about burning the Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a f. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so your Target, your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, they could burn this bitch to the ground and it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what Black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
Okay, I'm gonna switch. I love to start with this one because it's heavy, but heavy in a way that I like to make space for. I mean, partially because my job is to have uncomfortable conversations and real conversation. We're among friends, right? We come here monthly. I'm assuming you guys come here monthly. I've come here, this is my second month. And we have conversations about things that make us better, right? Better to serve young people, better to serve our communities, better to serve each other. So I start this conversation with this video because there's just so much to unpack with that. But if anybody would like to start with either in the chat or you can unmute yourself as well, what were your initial thoughts about this video? Just gives me an idea of where everybody's at, so I can meet you where you are.
Hi, I am Minerva from the Backside Learning Center. And I have seen this before, and I have seen the paper where it came from, okay, the document where it came from. And she's absolutely right. We're never going to catch up. So no matter what we do, how educated we are, you know, we're not going to catch up. You know, so when she put it in those contents and put it in your face, just the way she did it, with the anger, with the passion that she has, and she felt, I was like, right on it. You know, so I'm not disputing it. I'm just saying that we won't catch up. You know, we don't have privilege. We have earned privilege. You know, we have to tell people who we are in order for us to be accepted, and we're still not accepted. You know, how much education you have versus someone that's privileged. You just look at them, you know, regardless. You know, so the way she has said it, the way she expressed herself is really deep.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you. Because it was hard to watch at first as well. And I read that paper as well. And of course it was brilliant. But I'm always taken, I love the juxtaposition, because she's delivering a message that an academic might say, oh yes, this is all well researched, and because we know this to be true, right? But at the same time, she presents it in a way where some would dismiss it, like, what does she know? She's just some girl from the hood, right? So I love that part, even because social justice movements are one of the few places in scholarship where the scholarship and what's happening on the ground is happening in real time. Because if we think about the intersections of our identities, which we can go into more depth about that, there are so many people, especially a lot of Black feminist, you know, scholarship right now that's leading a lot of this work, where people are living on those intersections in real time, right? So you can have a whole PhD even and say, I do this work, or even just be a leading scholar in this work and still, you know, and still live in poverty even, right? So these things are not just something that is just up in the air, some abstract concept. It's happening in real time in your life. So I just love that juxtaposition, because we don't, like, you just assume, oh, this person has all of this access to media platform, this person has access to this education, so this is a concept. It's not a concept because it's real life. Anybody else? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I've seen this video a few times now, and it feels really relevant because I am an activist, and so I'm often in the streets, and I'm a trained street medic, so that's how I lend my skills to the cause. And so oftentimes when I am talking about my activism with other folks who don't do this work, they immediately jump to the whole looting and rioting piece of it, and don't consider these situations. But I think what most strikes me in this video is the lack of education that we have, especially as white folks, around the ways that our government and our culture have really, like, systematically oppressed and burned Black folks. I did not learn about the bombing of Black Wall Street or the Tulsa, any of that, until just a few years ago. And I am almost 40 years old. And I went to, even in my studies in college, through my gender studies and racial studies stuff in college, I didn't learn about those things. It really wasn't until I took a Racial Equity Institute training that I learned about the intricacies of the 400 years of history. This was not stuff that I was taught at all growing up. And yeah, that like, yeah, it just reaffirms my commitment to anti-racist work.
Oh, I'm so excited. You just go ahead and do the rest of this presentation for me. No, I'm just I'm just kidding. Thank you so much.
Well, to add to what Em was talking about, that's called allyship, and if we talk about allyship, then we know we have someone who has power, who's on our side, who will speak up when we're not around and will do something, who is doing something. So whatever you are doing, I really applaud you, and you're teaching others. So, oh, right, it took you all this time to learn about all this education, but what has happened? And here you are sharing it, educating others, and standing by us. So thank you.
Absolutely. And I see your allyship and I take it a step further. It sounds like you're more like an accomplice, which is another term folks are using right now. Because putting yourself, leveraging your privilege, right? And I'm skipping, this is exactly why I'm not married to any of my slides, because conversation is so valuable because it's somewhere in my presentation somewhere. And it keeps them interesting because I do them every day, right? But leveraging your privilege, like the first thing people say, well, I see this, what's happening in the world, and I just don't know what to do. And it is heavy, especially being in the middle of a global pandemic, which has broken the world in, I would almost argue, some beautiful ways. If you zoom out in some ways, that's a whole conversation for another day, making us see that there are things that aren't working. But it's heavy every day. And as we'll talk more and more about this, we'll talk about, this is really about systems. This isn't exactly about people, but it's absolutely about people. So when we take this idea of racism and really all the isms, all of them, and moving it from the individual to the collective, realizing that individuals can zoom in and zoom out in real time again, and make it about systems by making it about people, and understanding where we are in this matrix allows us to leverage the privileges that we do have, right? And again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but even thinking for myself where I lend my privilege, if I've had access to all this extra education, right? And I know that my skill set is to distill a whole lot of information from my own reading practices and from, my own research, then I may not be the person out in the street, but my privilege exists in a space where I have access to information all the time. So my privilege, I'm helping people navigate systems, and I'm making sure information is not just there, but it's accessible. So if you don't have time to devote an hour or two to reading every day, and I do, then I'm like, all right, this is what we're talking about. This is what's relevant. This is how I'm relaying this to you so you can use it, right? So definitely we appreciate that. Anyone else want to share their thoughts on this video, or just even where we are right now in this moment?
So I've never seen this actual video. I've seen a picture of her maybe on a magazine or on social media because I'm a social media fanatic. So being a millennial and a millennial of color, and a very emotional one at times, it's hard for me to put into words why I'm upset, why I'm frustrated when people who aren't of color ask. I often feel like I shouldn't have to tell you why I'm mad, because if you don't know, you're part of the problem. So to see this video and someone who looks relatively close to my age put into words using a game that everyone knows, Monopoly, it's very empowering, especially because I'm one of the only people of color in my association that's exempt. And so I am the youngest that holds my position. And so when we had Juneteenth a couple years ago, I came into work and was ready to turn up. No one knew what Juneteenth was. They all thought I was playing. And so me being dramatic, Felicia, you know me very well, me being dramatic and kind of over the top, they looked it up and was like, oh, it's real. And so they used the opportunity to incorporate it in our curriculum for our kiddos and just basically add themselves into the room. And so to see someone who looks like me, who can put it into words where everyone can adapt to, it's very empowering. So I like.
Yes, I'm glad. And just to let everybody know, when the workshop is done, I like to send a PDF of it out, and instead of reference lists, because those aren't really accessible, because it's just a long list that nobody really ever looks at, all of the links, even though it'll be a PDF, all of the links are because none of this information is mine, right? I did not create Antiracism. Clearly, if I did, I'd be doing this for free, and I may not even be doing it. I'd hire someone, right? But the cool thing is this information is all out there. And I'm skipping to the end when I say the solution here is there has never been a better time to pick up, the cause of anti-racism, really just liberation overall. Because if your racism isn't intersectional, if your feminism isn't intersectional, if your food justice, if any of your social justice work is not intersectional, we can, take that term apart if we need to, then it's not real. So, now I said that, but so you might find it cited somewhere, but all of this entire PowerPoint has links to articles, has links to videos, has links to all of those things. So if you do not, I love to present resources. So all of this is linked to something else, and then I provide additional resources. So that's also something too. So that way it meets everybody where they are, whether you're just starting your anti-racist journey, because it's a journey for all of us, or like some of you who have been doing this work for a really, really long time. We got something for everybody. All right. So moving on, let's see. All right. This is a poem. There's a Nubia Bennett poem that's the background. You can't really see it, but it says, if we wanted to, people of color could burn the world down for what we've experienced and are experiencing, but we don't. And that kind of goes along with Kimberly's, what she said at the end. She said, be glad that Black people are looking for equality and not revenge. Because it's real out here. And for those of you who are involved in any level of protest, with Breonna Taylor stuff or George Floyd, or insert hashtag here, because I can't even keep up, it's real. But it's real more than just police killings. As we know, this is systemic, right? So I tell folks that racism, really all forms of oppression, but specifically racism today, that's what we're talking about, is like a channel on a like the cable network is white supremacy, right? That's the cable network. And every channel is a different form of oppression. So it's sexism, when the oppression, just every level of oppression, ableism, ageism, adultism, all of those are different manifestations of oppression, which is like a different channel, right? So HBO could be playing. I know none of us have cable anymore, but I really like this as an analogy because nobody pays for cable anymore. But you can be watching HBO and HBO Spanish. You're watching the same show. One of them's dubbed in Spanish, right? Same show. It just looks different, right? So essentially, that's what all these forms of oppression are. Just a different manifestation of imperialism, colonialism. I cannot talk today, and white supremacy. So let's just see how it shows itself, right? So in the midst of the global pandemic, Black people are dying at all socioeconomic levels. We're not just talking about poor Black people. They're dying at a faster rate than their white counterparts. The number changes. Sometimes it's 2 to 3 times faster. So that points to medical racism, right? There's lots of levels to that, right? Because when you were thinking about lower income Black people more likely to live in intergenerational housing, which means they're closer in closer quarters with one another, and they have to work. They're more likely to be essential workers. So they're at these stores, they're at these fast food restaurants. We're not just nurses, we're nurse aides, we're hospital cleaning staff. A lot of that is not taken into account when we're thinking about who is cleaning up in the midst of a global pandemic, who is taking care of people, who's making sure people have their food in the middle of a pandemic. So they're more likely to catch it. And then there's also the medical racism in how they're treated and who's admitted to the hospital, what treatments they get and don't get. All these things are happening in real time. In addition to that, because we're in a double pandemic, I'm not even sure if this number is correct anymore because it changes so quickly. But every 28 hours or less, a Black person is killed by law enforcement with little consequence. And we've seen this here for sure. We just passed a landmark weekend. I'm sure I don't think there's anybody in here who doesn't know about Breonna Taylor. I don't even have to say that out loud, but there's been more since. right? Like every 28 hours, somebody is shot and killed by police. And there's no consequence. That's why it happens so often, right? There's been a policy release, this was last year, but the American Medical Association formally recognized racism as a public health threat. So that it's like a disease. I mean, it is a disease, but the American Medical Association is actually like, no, this is actually a public health threat. The same way that COVID is a public health threat. So you're absolutely in a double pandemic, right? Oops, I did not mean to click on that. No, that's not what I was doing. Sorry about that. Go back to this slide. Sorry about the clicking stuff. Hold on. Okay, there it goes. It went to another screen. All right. And then, of course, I love poetry because it says so much without saying a whole lot. Is whether you rock your pants sagging low in a three-piece suit, Jordan 5s or a Gucci boot, the truth is you're still strange fruit. And that comes from a Billie Holiday song, Strange Fruit, which talks about lynching, right? So I put that poem there because it doesn't matter if like respectability is a joke. It's the politics of changing the subject, right? So we talk about like, why don't they just clean up? Why don't they pull themselves up by their bootstraps? Why don't they, fix, just go to school, do all the things? And I'd like to say specifically our generation, I'm somewhere in the 80s, 90s generation, right? I'm a big age. But our generation was sold this idea that, clean up real nice and go to college, right? And so now not only did we, respectability politics isn't new, right? It's not new at all. Our parents' generation and our parents' generations were told clean up real nice and they'll treat you better. That's a lie. But then on top of that, so we were told that clean up real nice, be respectable, do the right things in public, but then go to college, right? Get loans because it's going to pay off and then they'll treat you better. So now you have a generation of folks that are walking around with a house worth of loans, literally, that create another chain to our existence and make it harder for us to survive day to day. Similar to what Kimberly was saying in terms of like you add it in there and we just don't ever win. Because it's a fact, right, that Black women are the most educated demographic by rate, right? Like by rate because the numbers, numbers are fuzzy, right? But by rate, we are the most educated. We also shoulder 2/3 of the student loan debt. And we're more likely to attend for-profit universities, which have lower graduation rates, which means that a lot of folks attended a whole bunch of school, got a whole bunch of student loan debt, and don't have anything to show for it. So I show you all of these articles that seem like disparate and not necessarily related, mainly to let you know that it's because it's systemic, it's literally everywhere. It's in the air we breathe, water we swim in, insert another analogy, it's that, right? I've been having a lot of conversations. Respectability is a joke. It's a joke. Now I will say it is a survival tool, right? Because for individuals, it works. For certain individuals, it absolutely works. But what it also does is it creates a generation of folks, which that's probably a conversation for a whole other day, that invest all of their work in performance, even and especially in social justice movements. And I'm going to leave that where that is. That's probably an offhand conversation for another day, but respectability politics holds that together as well, which impedes progress. So if we're serious about anti-racism work, we have to be serious about getting rid of that barrel. We talk about crabs in the barrel, getting rid of the whole barrel, right? Because respectability politics keeps us in that barrel, and that's imposed on ourselves. Another conversation for another day, but we can hold on to all these nuggets for questions and answers. I love these kinds of conversations anyway. So I'm going to introduce everybody to some critical terms because I know that everybody is coming to this work from a very different, from different levels, right? Which is great because that means we have a lot of resources in the room. But just some of the key terms that I'm going to use today, because I'm gonna throw them around, and I'm not a fan of alphabet soup in real life or conceptually, because people love to throw these words around and then nobody knows what they mean. And then it just makes you sound like you just know stuff, and that's not really making it accessible, right? So we hear about white privilege all the time, right? We hear about it. They're like, what is it? It's an invisible set of unearned assets, which I can count on cashing in each day. I think that Peggy McIntosh, if you've ever read The Invisible Knapsack, which is an excellent activity, I would encourage. It's an article. They have activities based on that. I would encourage you to read it if you haven't done that yet. But basically, any form of privilege, but in this case specifically white privilege, you basically feel as though you're moving through the air and moving through the world and everything is equal. But you have unearned privileges that other people don't have, right? So I like to equate that to something like when you don't have any money and you know it. You know you don't have any money. You're looking at all the things, you're window shopping, you're like, ooh, I really need that dress. I don't have no money though, so I can't get it. It's just a fact. It's the same thing, but when you have that money, when you have money, right? It's the difference between getting a 4 for $4 at Wendy's and being like, no, go ahead, give me that deluxe chicken because I can get that today. But you take it for granted when you have it. You don't notice that you have that extra $8. I think that's how much it costs at Wendy's to get a whole combo now. It's expensive. Or when you don't have the money and you like, let me scrounge these $4 little dollars together and I still might not have enough and I still might not get it. You don't notice that until you don't have it. So thinking of white privilege is just unearned assets. And it's not personal. It feels personal when somebody calls you out on having privilege or not having privilege, but it's systemic. So it is, again, I repeat this over and over. It is about you and it isn't about you at the same time, all the time. Whiteness. That seems like a very simple thing to, I mean, we know what it is, but we don't ever define it. But the reason why is because it changes. If you look at the definitions of what whiteness was at the beginning of last century to now, even it's changed. But before that, who was white and who wasn't changed? I mean, who was white and who wasn't changed all the time. It always does, because the concept of whiteness is emphatically linked to anti-Blackness, because whiteness changes because, one, you know, we're on pace for whiteness to be a minority, whiteness as a race, which is a social construct, to be a minority by, I think it's like 2040. It changes. You see it different sources cite different times, but if you keep changing the definition, if you keep moving the goalposts, then, you know, we'll be like, oh, no, we're not minorities. We're not, you know, but it's because it's a social construct and it doesn't exist, but the ramifications do. So when we say whiteness, we mean just this, it's a set of standards. I mean, like beauty standards, that proximity to whiteness, you can determine it's how people look, because it's not really an ethnicity, because it changes. So white supremacy, I'm gonna get further in the making sure I'm keeping up with time. White supremacy is defined by a lot of things, but it's white dominance especially, and I'm gonna go further into that in a little bit. It shows up everywhere, and that's how different forms of oppression manifest through white supremacy, and we'll look further into how that happens. And then what's racism? Because we're trying to be anti-racist, we need to know what racism is, right? So racism is just race, prejudice, and social and institutional power all together. That's what it is. That's why Black people, you hear Black people can be racist. No, absolutely not. They can be prejudiced. We can be prejudiced based on how someone looks and who looks, but we don't have power. So that's not a real thing. So when you hear that, just correct people gently or not gently, depending on your relationship to that person and how you want that interaction to go. It's not possible. So when people say it, I don't have, since I'm training people that care about this stuff, I don't have the capacity to do a lot of correcting anymore. I used to, I don't have it. I'll just let them think what they want, because this isn't about people in that way. But for people who have capacity, absolutely just let them know that that it's about power, and Black people don't have it. So it's not possible. So now this is one of my favorite graphics in talking about white supremacy, because people always say, like, why do we always have to go right to white supremacy? Like, because it's a personal feeling. It's uncomfortable. Like, I'm not a white person, but I would imagine if I was, like, somebody being like, white supremacy is the root of all evil, I feel like I would be offended if I didn't have historical context or anything. I was raised by historians, by the way, so like everything is historical context, right? But so this is the way that white supremacy shows up. This like most graphics, like most facts when dealing with social justice, this is already kind of outdated, because I'd say after 2016, there isn't a line between overt white supremacy and covert white supremacy. It's all out there and it's all there, right? So, but I keep it because I think that, you know, things may calm down now that we have a different president or whatever, because people will be like, oh, that was a rough 4 years. Go back to normal now. Like normal wasn't super problematic before. Similar to the way they did when Obama was elected. They were like, oh, racism is gone. We have a whole Black president. We saw the backlash for that, right? So this white supremacy pyramid, you'll see this a lot. A lot of folks who are doing social justice work and presenting about social justice work actually use this a lot, because it basically puts how these things show up and how these things show up. Obviously, people aren't, I would say people aren't actively lynching people, but that remains to be seen, because there was a whole noose at the, right. I see your face, right. But that's usually what they attribute to white supremacy. Oh, lynching, like back in the 1800s, which obviously people are still getting lynched today. Actually, we see it a lot in the South. It actually happens and people get hung like in the old days, actually. And that's why we see the nooses at the Capitol and stuff like that. That is probably a symbol of white supremacy. But even the hiring discrimination, discriminatory lending, we know what happened with houses. We look at what's happening with housing during COVID, evictions, all of this stuff. Celebration of Columbus Day, something that seems innocuous until you discover the history of it, right? Or even when white people say, I am an ally, right? And you said it, it's like a nickname. If you gave it to yourself, it's probably not true, right? That's not your real name. That's not your real nickname because you gave it to yourself, right? Or even something as innocuous as, I have good intentions though, I'm a good person, and then dismissing, you absolving your own guilt because you said, no, I'm a good person. And so somebody is telling you, you harmed me, or a decision you made harmed me, a policy you created harmed me. And they're like, no, but I'm a good person. That's racism. And that is upholding white supremacy. So we see it literally everywhere. It might not come in the form of racial slurs. Like, you might not get called. I couldn't tell you the last time somebody actively called me the N-word, at least not to my face, right? I couldn't tell you that, but I can tell you that I've experienced me telling somebody, this is how I feel about what just happened. And they're like, I think you need more people to confirm what you experienced. Okay, because what I say is not good. Okay. Or just denying that racism is even a thing. That upholds white supremacy, because we can't address something that we won't face, right? So a lot of this stuff shows up as microaggressions, which is something we could get into another day at another time. But I mean, really, and that's something that is important, considering a lot of you all work with young people and you work with staffs that work with young people. But then also recognizing that the structures we exist in are actually racist by nature. I work for a university, right? And I love school. I will collect all the degrees if they'll pay me to get them, right? I'll write my papers. I enjoy it, right? But I also recognize that none of this is neutral. And I also recognize that I'm actively participating in a racist structure, but I'm also resisting it too, where I spot it and where I can leverage my own privilege to change it, and where I can collaborate with other people who are doing the same thing so we can actually collectively do something. So I gave you all this information and all this terminology around what racism is. And I always like to hurry up and switch over. Okay, so what can we do about it? Because we have a lot of you can do a quick Google search at this point to look for manifestations of racism, because it's literally everywhere. First of all, it's everywhere. Second of all, like I said before, it's a really, really good time to really delve deep into wanting to become anti-racist, because there are literally people who have given their lives and their professions around various forms of liberation work and various forms of research, whether you're into research, whether you're into direct action, whether you're into community building. There are so many places that you tap into. We literally do not have to create something new. And I get it. I don't want to say I get into it, but I sometimes find myself in conflict with community folks who are like, but I have this program. And I'm like, guess what? Because I work for the city as well, right? So you can imagine there were oftentimes people say, well, I want to start this program. I want to start with this program. I always tell people that, so my dad was Dr. J. Blaine Hudson, right? And I don't know if you all are familiar with him, but he was a historian in this city. He was also the first Black Dean of Arts and Sciences at U of L, here at U of L. And when I was a kid, or not a kid, I was maybe like 16, 17, I didn't like to be called a kid, so I won't call, and 16, 17-year-olds don't like to be called kids, so we won't call them that. But I was a young person, and I would say, you know, I was raised by, you know, activists. My mom was also a social justice person as well. So I would say, well, I have this idea. I want to start this program. I want to do this, you know, want to make my parents proud that I've been thinking about this stuff. And his first question would be, well, what are the people around you doing? And anybody who knew him knows that he would ask a question like that. And I mean, it just burst my little bubble. Cause I mean, he was real smart and stuff. And if he's like, you don't have enough information, I'm feeling offended, because I feel like, you know, I've been working hard. Absolutely. But what I got from that is he used to tell me all the time, if you don't know what the people around you are doing, then how do you know that what you're doing is going to be impactful and help add to this conversation, right? So, not to say that creating new programs and all of this stuff like that is not good, but I can tell you that there are resources and programs and people who have been doing this work for years and years and years who need fresh blood, who need fresh ideas. Add to that. And actually, that'll make your work that much more impactful because you understand where the gaps are. So I threw that in. That's not what this slide is, but I just like to throw that out there because this is how we become anti-racist collectively. But I'll zoom back in and we'll think about this on a more interpersonal and a personal level if we all want to be anti-racist, right? So the definition of it, people have mixed feelings about this book. I won't share mine. I facilitate a book discussion group about it. So read it or don't read it. I do like this definition, in that anti-racism at its core is a powerful system. No, because racism is a powerful system that creates false hierarchies of human value. And the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify it and describe it and then dismantle it. So we can do that as individuals, recognizing that it's a system, first of all. We can do that as individuals, but we can do that in our organizations and in our systems as well. And so if anyone follows, I don't know if you all are familiar with, say, Adrienne Marie Brown and Emergent Strategies. I love that book. That's another resource. Write that one down too, where you can literally build movements by starting small. The difference between being anti-racist and thinking racism is like an individual thing, and the difference between those two things is recognizing it is systems. Also recognizing that in these systems are institutions, but institutions are made of people, right? So wherever we are in our institutions, being intentionally anti-racist, meaning we are identifying where these racist practices exist, racist structures exist. We start small, but we keep the system in mind at all times. So it requires us to be looking at ourselves and looking at the big picture all the time. I'm gonna tell you right now, it's exhausting because it's literally my whole job. So that, in a way, that's a privilege because I'm like, oh, so the only thing I have to worry about is identifying racism all the time. Yeah, but then you're never off. But this is how we change our organizations, and we change ourselves first. We change the people around us. We have these conversations, and we are anti-racist in our actions all the time because anti-racism is a muscle. I mentioned before that, all institutions are racist inherently. And I'll say this at work. And I believe in being fully transparent, right? So I go to U of L, both my degrees come from there. My livelihood comes from there now. It came from there before because my dad worked at U of L. So I've been around U of L my entire life. And I will tell you, this university has a history. Every institution has a history of being problematic. I work for the city, absolutely has a history of being problematic. I've worked for a different university, absolutely has a history of being problematic, because racism is the air that we breathe, right? So I don't know if you all are familiar, but last year about July, our new president, Dr. Nubia Bennett, she announced that University of Louisville would become a premier research anti-racist university, right? So we wanted to be known across the country for being an anti-racist university. That work was starting when she got there. My office started in 2016. This came out last year for the whole university. But she acknowledges that the epidemic of racism and inequity has always been a part of our society, but we are seeing the impact now in sharp focus and clarity. This was after Breonna Taylor's murder. And it's not enough to say I'm not racist. We have to become anti-racist. And that's in structure, that's in institution, that's in system, and that's in individuals. So that's not something that I'm saying I'm taking lightly, because there are problems here too. So we're actively working here too to change it. So, but how do we do that? Because I like to turn, take a turn finally, like, okay, racism, okay, we get it. Now what? It's important to ask questions. And now this is where you guys get to come back and talk to me. So there's a series of questions that I want you to just sit with while I read through them. And then I'd like you all to just think about your own organizations through a lens of being anti-racist, recognizing that it is structural and systemic, but it starts with you. I'm going to ask these questions, sit with them, and then I'd love for folks to put it into the chat. We can go over that and then unmute yourselves, and we can talk about it. So as we think about our own organizations, I want you to think about who works in your organization and department, and who holds leadership positions, and who's on your board. Who makes decisions in your organization and department? Who has control and influence over financial resources? What kind of education or opportunities to discuss racism are offered through your organization and department? How does your organization or department work intentionally with communities of color? What is your organization's department's value and mission statement? Do outcomes match that statement? And would communities of color agree? Who regularly accesses your service? And are they able to do it comfortably? How might images confront or challenge or perpetuate racism? And really any other questions around how your organization interacts with and represents itself to communities of color. And anybody's free to speak up on any one of these things.
Hi, friends. It's Em again. I always feel like I'm speaking up in these things. So I am new to Louisville, and I'm new to LYG, the organization that I work for. And a lot of LYG folks are white. And as somebody who is a practicing anti-racist, and coming into this organization, I'm definitely being very critical of everything. And, noticing that not only is our board mostly white, our staff is mostly white, if not all white. A lot of our youth participants are white. And so it's just permeating. And what's really, I think what's been really great for me is that our organization is finally going through a strategic planning process. And both myself and one of the other new employees who was also an activist and practicing anti-racist white person, we have kind of allied ourselves to really change the organization. And so we've been lucky to have a seat at the table in that strategic planning process, and we have been able to actually incorporate anti-racist language and literally the term decolonization into our strategic plan.
Wow.
We are working to, we're working to change things. And we're having to do a lot of education for our white board members and white team members and things, but it's necessary work. And, I think for me as program director, I want to make sure that even with the work and effort that I'm doing to bring the organization up to speed and move things along, I'm always concerned that I'm not doing enough, or that, to that last point, not the last point. Which one is it? Would communities of color agree? I don't know. I mean, I'm also just starting in this job, but that is always at the forefront of my mind is, am I doing enough, and am I doing it the right way? And would those communities of color that we hope to serve and really bring on board and help build leadership in, would they agree?
No, thank you for your work. And I think, and especially you said you're with LYG, and I think more organizations that promote this intersectional justice, I think that's exciting, because I live and breathe by that mantra that it's all of us or none of us. So I'm shutting down everybody. It's we're not just anti-racist, we're anti-sexist, I don't do transphobia. I'm actively like that. I'm glad that they paid me to do that, because I would have been that way anyway, and I don't do well in spaces that aren't that way. But I think I had this conversation in another training, especially in your case, you're saying, oh, because I'm new. But the training I was having yesterday, it was someone who was new to just social justice work in managing, right, offices and stuff like that. And this person was saying, well, I don't know what to do because I don't want to mess up. And I equate, and I love analogies and metaphors in case y'all haven't noticed, but I almost equate learning to be anti-racist, or really just looking for social justice, real social justice and real liberation. So that I don't have to list every other kind of thing. It's a lot to keep saying, right? But to see you later, Kay. I see you in the chat. Thank you for joining us. But in doing that work, it's almost like learning a language. And I tell this story that when I came back to Louisville, I lived in Phoenix for a year. And I was like, oh, Louisville's so segregated. So I joined a Spanish church when I first moved. It was about 10 years ago. And I went and I was fumbling through the language, because I did it because I didn't have to do it if I didn't want to, right? Because Louisville is that segregated. If I just want to deal with Black and white people all day, I can go to work, deal with white people, go home, deal with Black people. That's it, right? So I didn't like living in a segregated city anymore, because I'd experienced what it was like to not live in a segregated city. But when I got there, I was nervous first. I was nervous in a similar way, that they would be like, what is she doing here? She's not fluent in Spanish. Why is she here? And I think when they could see that I was there, like I am willing to trip all over my own 2 feet, okay? Like I am messing these words up. People give you grace. People give you lots, in some cases, with some people, almost sometimes more grace than you deserve. Because I know they gave me way more grace than I deserve. But I think to your point about being new, because you're obviously very comfortable in these spaces, as you incorporate more people of color into your space, and I'm excited about that for you all. People, when people are listened to, and I think I learned this a lot when I would come to BLOCS training, when we do positive youth development and social justice youth development. When people feel listened to, they will grant you the grace that you need to create the space because they're co-creating it. So that's really exciting to hear, especially for an organization like LYG, because I mean, as we know, like in general, not so much Louisville, I don't have Louisville statistics, like Black trans young people have it so hard, and they're more likely to ideate suicide and so many things, right? Because they don't have community. So building community for our most vulnerable folks is golden for so many reasons. So that's exciting. That's really exciting. Anyone else have any feedback on any of these questions?
Sure, Nubia. I'll go ahead and share. So I'm Aaron, and I work at the Iroquois Library, and I work in children's services. So I've been doing this job like 2 years, and if you do the math, like half of that has been in a pandemic.
Yay.
So, you know, I have educational training in social sciences, anthropology, sociology. And I just, you know, it's a whole nother story how I ended up in this position, but I've been trying to find my way. And I, you know, discovered anti-racism as a concept and a practice, you know, summer of 2020. So I'm a baby anti-racist. If I'm allowed to, I'd like to identify as an anti-racist.
You can, absolutely.
Okay. But so I, you know, is an institution, I'm just like one of almost 300 employees for the Louisville's library system. So I mean, who's in charge? It's a lot of white men and women for the most part. You know, when you go up towards administration, I think at most of the branches, the majority of managers are white men or women, largely women. There are some women of color, but not many. And then in children's services, you know, it's also not very diverse. I'm one of 4 men. One of those men is a Black man. There's a couple of women of color, but it's a largely white group. And, you know, librarians generally, especially in children's services, generally are very liberal, but liberal, we all know liberal is not the same as anti-racist, right?
Absolutely.
There's a huge gap. And which is like, you know, the pieces that I've been filling in since the summer. And so kind of where I'm at right now, I guess, is trying to figure out what can I do. And, you know, I do work with adult patrons that come in to use computers and get services. And, you know, we have rules that we enforce, and sometimes people are asked to leave. And so I think of anti-racism when I'm handling that, but I'm mostly focused right now on my children's work because, like, and I mentioned this briefly at the implicit bias training, but, you know, something like 13% of children's books ever have characters of color as like main characters. And so, you know, if books are mirrors for kids to relate to different experiences and things like that, then there's just that's something that's missing for Black and brown children. And so, you know, I have been trying to like read more books with almost only, like, in some schools that I'm reading with, as long as I've done it, almost all the books have been about children of color. And I guess I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm like, you know, I guess I have one thought that it's like, if nobody else is reading to this classroom of mostly white children, but also all races. If they're not hearing or seeing these characters, you know, from me, it's potential that other readers that are reading books to them, or if they're not, they might not see those characters. But then on the other side of that, there's like, oh, well, then do people want to hear me read a book about discrimination about Black girls? You know,
Yes,
like, am I
absolutely.
okay? So
Yes.
yeah, I guess, you know, like I said, I'm a baby anti-racist. I'm a white guy in America trying to do what's right, and it's tough sometimes. So okay, thank you, Nubia.
Of course. So like that's the thing, because that's why I like to give that example of me going to this Spanish church, right? Like partially I'm wanting to just go because I want to brush up on my Spanish, right? But like to build community, that discomfort is a growth edge, right? So and usually I say this at the beginning. I don't know. I guess I changed up my PowerPoint so much that I forgot to put it in there. But I always say that we're supposed to feel uncomfortable, because when you're going against systems, I mean, of course, we're still participating in these systems. Of course, we have to, because, you know, we still have to keep roofs over our heads. We got to get food on our table, clothes on our back, etc. Right? We exist in this world and it's real. Those things are real. But when we are resisting it, it often feels like if you're right-handed, you're trying to write with your left hand, right? And that's super uncomfortable. But the more you do it, the less discomfort you feel, right? So if you're reading, you're normalizing something, because by definition in this culture, in this country, I would say in this country, but the United States best export is racism. That is the biggest export is racism.
Oh yeah.
Great meeting you, Minerva. Great seeing you.
Yeah.
But like that's the greatest export is racism. So
right.
You're considered normal, right? Because you are a white man. And when somebody says leader, when somebody's like, who's the boss? They're looking for a white man, right? So you're normalizing, you're leveraging your privilege. And that's why I talk about that at the very beginning, is the way that we dismantle these systems is we identify what's happening. But then if we understand privilege and oppression, then we're leveraging wherever we have privilege. So if right now where your privilege is they see you, you're the person that reading to kids or helping people get on the internet or whatever. I mean, I don't know if folks are doing a lot of that now with COVID because they're not coming in, right?
We're doing it by appointment. So yeah, we are having people come in. It's just limited.
It changes like every week, right? Yeah. Like I'm like, I don't even know what people are doing nowadays. But
yeah.
If you're the person that people are interacting with and you're normalizing, hey, I'm reading this book to these kids and it's about discrimination. It's about Ruby Bridges. It's about this. It's about that. Then you're making it normal, right? We don't have to make everything exceptional. I think that's part of the problem, is that we're wanting everything to be exceptional, everything, which is another export of America is exceptionalism, which is a joke, right? So, sure. So no, absolutely. Keep reading it, keep finding more books, right? Because you have a unique opportunity to say, we need more of these books. And that's you talking upward and downward. So absolutely, keep doing it.
And can I share something as you're talking about exports of racism?
Mm-hmm.
So something that's just been blowing my mind is I've been, in this journey at work and as an anti-racist, I'm, getting into the history of children's books. And, aside from them just being missing characters, I mean, so there's so many songs and books that are rooted in minstrelsy.
Mm-hmm.
Which is just mind-blowing for me that Five Little Monkeys was a blackface act.
Absolutely.
And it was it had different words and things like that. But I struggle with being in a public excuse me, being in a public library, we're all about intellectual freedom, and I really struggle with the intersection of intellectual freedom and white supremacy because white people have made most of the books, they have most of the power, they have the administration power, they have the academic power to create the idea of intellectual freedom to protect these books, these stories that have helped to perpetuate implicit bias in other children, generations ago that participated in protesting integration and all these things. yeah, it's a part of it. And so for all those parents and children's book readers, look into what you're reading and the histories of some of those classics.
Absolutely. I mean, Dr. Seuss was a couple of days ago, the article on Dr. Seuss.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, he wrote minstrels for his high school. And the Cat in the Hat was probably inspired by an elevator worker who wore a red bow tie and had a smile that he liked. Yeah. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. No, definitely. Keep doing it. Keep growing. You called yourself an anti-racist baby. Keep growing.
Thanks,
we
Nubia.
appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Anyone else want to share? There'll be other opportunities to share, but definitely.
Sorry, really quickly. My name is Jaden and I work for FLP, the Food Literacy Project. And like M, our organization is going through a strategic planning process right now. And I'm super grateful because I get to be a part of that. And also members of our board are a part of that. And our board president is actually a Black woman now. She just, she's been a member of the board, but she just came on as the president recently. And so having her guidance has been really tremendous. But one of the things that, as an organization, we've been doing a lot of intentional work towards anti-racism and just identifying ways that we can leverage our privilege because we are a staff of all white people. And so we have, people of color on our board, but our staff is currently white. And so one of the things that we have identified in our strategic plan is that moving forward within the next 3 years, we're hoping to have at least a quarter of our staff be made up of people of color because we believe that that's important. But one of the things that I think that we are still trying to figure out is how to intentionally work with communities of color outside of just program participants. We're doing more work in the West End, and we have acknowledged that it's inappropriate for us to come in as the experts when there are so many experts in food justice and in food related programming in the West End. And so just trying to figure out ways to leverage partnerships, but what would it look like to then take a backseat and act more in a supporting role with, either the funding that we have or the human power that we have to run some of those programs. And so just as a staff, we're trying to figure out what that would look like as we're making those steps to move more into the West End, but just take kind of a backseat in some of that.
No, that's wonderful. And just as you were talking, I just thought of organizations that came to mind in terms of food justice in the West End. I know Feed the West obviously was huge last year. They fed 100,000 families. And organizations like Change Today, Change Tomorrow, Black Market. I went to high school with Chantrice. I feel like I end up throwing those names out a lot. But then also there's the mobile market. I can't think of their name right now. The Megan Bell. She was in the news recently. Those are just some organizations offhand. And it is very wise of you to think of it like I'm coming in here. I'm not an expert. Just let me know what you want to do, because you have to think about it at the same time as you think about justice movements and you're thinking about your flavor of justice. There are other things happening in those areas, right? So when you come just to the West End and you're like, oh, I'm here because I want to help. At the same time, there's gentrification happening in very old parts of the West End. And people are going to look at you like, excuse me? Because honestly, if you came down my dad's street right now, I'd be like, okay, what are you doing here? Because at the same time, there are people texting and calling saying, hey, we want to buy your house, right? Yeah. That'll help you because you'll have money, right? But you want to So absolutely. Leveraging those partnerships and being very clear on the front end, whatever you want us to do, you live in these areas or you work in these areas every day, let us know. And this, again, I keep saying this is a perfect time for folks who are really serious about anti-racist work because the groundwork has been laid. This isn't new work for communities of color. This is a survival, right? Yeah. So now you have scholars and you have people who do policy work and you have people who do community work. And I say this in mixed company and outside of mixed company all the time. what we really have to focus on is infrastructure, because we literally have all the moving pieces that we need.
Yeah.
What we need is capacity, and what we need is infrastructure, because that's why every 10 years we're doing the same work all over again, because we're building out instead of inward, and building inward is really where you can create lasting movements. So keep asking questions. I am just going to throw in a little bit to mix this up, because obviously folks are at different points of anti-racist work. And I figured whittling it down to a few things to remember, because we've been talking straight through for about an hour and a half, like what can we actually remember and do every day? Absolutely, the things you are doing in your spaces is fabulous. I'm excited that people are excited to do this work. That makes my job easier, because then I'm like, hey, I'll just drop some resources here and, you know, say a quick story or two and keep it moving, right? Because people are learning and people are growing on their own too. So people are doing their outside work. But how can we be anti-racist, both interpersonally, personally, and structurally, right? All of these things we can do every single day, and not add to our list of things to do, right? So one of these things would be, of course, understanding the definition of racist. And I said that at the beginning when people are like, but Black people can be racist too. Absolutely not, because you don't have power, right? So understanding these definitions and correcting people, right? Like, nope, you're wrong. So that, especially if you are a white ally or accomplice, or you'd like to be one, since someone else has to name that for you, then you can, especially when you call it out, because you are leveraging your privilege in real time. Absolutely not. That's not racist, or absolutely that is racist, and understanding it from a real definition and not something that's just made up, right? Because alternative facts is not real, right? Stop saying, I don't know that anybody in this room has that issue, since it's a voluntary training. I'm hoping that most people are not walking around saying I'm not racist, because we realize that's the water we swim in, the air we breathe, it's literally everywhere, right? So Anne Braden, I don't know if anybody is familiar with her. She died in 2006, I believe, but she was this white woman who did all this anti-racist. She's a fascinating woman, right? Little bitty white woman too. Like I'm 5'2", but I think she's shorter than me, because she was tiny, with a little chili bowl cut. She was wonderful. But she did all this amazing anti-racist work through the 60s up until she passed away. I mean, she would always say to folks, I'm absolutely a racist because I'm white, right? And she had no problem saying that. She would check other white people, like, you racist? I'm a racist, you're a racist, we all are racist. But she did anti-racism work, because and what that did was identify that this is systemic, and that if you didn't open your mouth to say, to be actively anti-racist, you could benefit and let somebody know that you are doing anti-racism work. Nobody would ever know, because you're a white person, right? Or you're white presenting, since that's not real anyway, right? So don't say it, because we know it's not personal, it's systemic. You do anti-racism work, but all white people in that sense are racist, because if you don't open your mouth, you benefit. And even when you do, you still benefit, right? So just keeping that in mind, that's how you are anti-racist. And you also identify racial inequities and disparities whenever you can. Be gracious to yourself. We're in the middle of a pandemic, especially. When you see it, call it out, right? You're going to miss stuff, because this stuff changes every day. It changes all the time. I tell people, don't even worry. And so that when somebody calls you out, don't even get mad, because it's like, I get called out on stuff all the time, because I'm not perfect, because this information changes and it's evolving. It's why people do hard sciences instead of social science, because it changes. It's like all gray areas. That's okay, though. That is supposed to be like that, right? So confront racist ideas you've held and continue to hold. So on this anti-racism journey, you may say something about a neighborhood. You may have an implicit, which you did implicit bias training already. So those of you who were here last month, you know how quickly those things creep up and you don't even think about it, right? We talk about good schools versus bad schools. We talk about that person just doesn't feel right. They don't act right. What does that even mean, right? So confront those racist ideas. Take the judgment out of them when you realize that it's systemic and it's literally in the air. It's like, oh, well, there goes another one. Darn it. It happens every day. It's fine. It's not having those racist ideas because they're everywhere, literally. It's what you do with them once you identify that they're there that determines who you are, right? Because it's a journey. Understanding how your anti-racism needs to be intersectional. I've said it and I will say it over and over and over and over again. if it's not intersectional, if any of your social justice ideas, if any of your liberation ideas are not intersectional, they're not liberation ideas, because it's all of us or it's none of us. Because at the root of it, it is white supremacy that is what creates these different modes of oppression. And I take a minute here to think about what happened in Atlanta, right? And how I think it was 6 or was it 8 of those Asian people were shot by a white supremacist. They tried to, it was 8, right? That's what I thought. And then like they were shot, and they're talking about him as a kid. He's 21 years old, and we know 16-year-olds don't like to be called kids. So no, it was a white supremacist man, grown person, okay, is responsible legally for all of his things, right? If we're following the rules. And it was a white supremacist act. Any other way that they describe it, but what that brings up, other than it being a tragedy, is just the intersectional nature of white supremacy, right? Because if we think about, I think 2 of them were women, I think, and I think they said that I've seen some. This happened yesterday, so I don't have all the facts. So if I'm wrong, somebody call me out because I don't have all the facts. But what I know is that at least 2 of them were women, identified as women. And I think that some of them may have been even sex workers, right? So that right there is thinking about 6 of the 8 killed were women. Okay, see, told you I was wrong. I don't have a problem being wrong. Call me out all the time. I'm with it. So the point is that we have to look at the intersection, because that's still white supremacy at work, because it's not just anti-Black, right? It's anti anything that's not white, anything that's not male, anything that's not, that's why you have to understand privilege, right? So that's why I say it's all of us or none of us. Any other explanation isn't real. I hate to be that way, but that's where I land on that. You can land somewhere else. Because we have to protect the least of us, right? So keeping that in mind, that's why it's important to do all liberation work. And it sounds like a lot more work, but if you think about it like that, which parts of these identities have privilege, which parts of these identities are oppressed, that's actually not that complicated. It just sounds that way. But anti-racism isn't really generative unless it's intersectional. So I think that's a nicer way for me to say it. I'll say it like that. And just champion anti-racist ideas and policies, champion them. So Aaron, you talked about, like, I really want to read these books. I really want people to, I want people to know that it's okay to read, books about children of color, because I want these kids to see it. Do that, right? And nobody will ever come down. Nobody that's doing anti-racism work, let me say that. Nobody that's doing anti-racism work will ever say, why is this white man reading these books? I can guarantee you they're not going to say that. And if they are, they're not doing anti-racism work. So simple. I like to simplify things. It don't have to be that complicated. So you keep doing it even when it feels uncomfortable. And these are all things we can literally do every day, and it doesn't add to our ever-growing to-do list. It's the lens with which we view the world and make decisions. And they help our implicit biases for those of us who took that training last month, because it makes us stop, slow down, and think about our actions, so that any biases that we do have are getting checked through these to-do items, right? I told y'all I love to give y'all all the resources. These are just a few. Because, I already told y'all about Kendi's book. That one is pretty good for definitions, I guess. I have mixed feelings about that book, and I like to be transparent. But any resource, honestly, any resource that takes you from a place that you were to a place that you are now is a good place to start. I didn't say it's a good resource. I said it's a good place to start. And the difference there is because I've been on I say at least a 10-year reading schedule. Because my dad also told me, if you want to, if you're reading every day, because he read every single day, right? And I don't know how many of you all are familiar with who he was, but he would say he would be home watching TV and he'd be reading every day. And I'm like, I don't know how you do that. I still don't do that, watching TV and read, but he read every single day, every day. And he scheduled time to do that. Not everybody has time to do that. But again, I said that whatever your lane is, for me, consuming a lot of information and making it accessible to folks is what I do. So that's a practice that I do. So I'm not telling everybody to do that. But I will say, if you do have time to read some of these resources and you start there, the cool thing is, if you're on social media or you follow scholarship or you talk or in these circles, the people that are doing real work right now are calling out each other, not in a bad way, but like, hey, I got this from this person. So it will create a reading list for you. My dad handed me Manning Marable's Malcolm X book 10 years ago, right before I started graduate school. I will tell you that it's incredibly dense and it's like 600 pages. And I did not enjoy reading that book as much as he did because he was a historian. Okay. But I didn't know what my next book was going to be because I was like, I don't know. Then I just looked it up and see who was talking about Manning Marable's book, right? And a lot of times they wrote books too, right? Or on social media, I am active on social media. So I would go and follow the authors that I was like, I like that book. Let me go follow Ijeoma Luo. Let me go follow her, right? And I did, right? Let me go follow Damon Young. Let me go follow just different folks that were doing Brittany Cooper. And you'll realize how small these networks are. And these are people who are doing this work. And you can read there and they'll basically tell you who else is doing work. That's how you tap in. So I didn't mean to make this presentation about reading, but when I tell you that that was one of the golden pieces of advice that he gave me was if you're reading a lot, you will be about 5 to 10 years ahead of a lot of folks because it's and audiobooks. Absolutely. I have a hard time paying attention when I'm not writing things down or looking at them and touching them. I guess what is that? I'm kinesthetic or whatever. But for a lot of folks who like to consume information that way, audiobooks are a great way of doing it. And that'll tell you what to read next. But these are good places to start because there's microaggressions, talking about race. Ijeoma's book is really great because it's written in a language that's super accessible. So if you don't like reading a bunch of alphabet soup, that's what I call it. But because I'm also in grad school now, so I'm reading and I'm like, why do they write this like this? It annoys me. But those are some really good books. For white people specifically, white fragility is really good. It's a good conversation. I know Metro United Way had they did a talk with her, I think, like a couple weeks ago or a week or two ago. I missed it, but I heard that, you know, I've not finished that book, but I've looked at it and it's a good one too. But these are just good places to start. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. And there are podcasts. I mean, you can literally just go down wherever you get podcasts. There are so many great podcasts if you need to listen to it. Social media is a great place to start too if you use it, because those folks that are doing this work are active on social media as well. Y'all don't need to start nothing. That's what I keep trying to tell y'all. If y'all ain't heard that yet, y'all don't have to start nothing yet. Build infrastructure, for sure. Now, I'm doing good on time. This is great. So for this last part, instead of it being question and answer, well, not instead, feel free to ask whatever questions you like if you haven't done so already. But I would like for those of us, you know, who feel like we've moved from anywhere, because this is an ongoing thing. This is why I love this visual, this becoming anti-racist visual, because it identifies where we are any given day. If you have a visual like this somewhere, you could be anywhere, right? Because I think I did a check-in at the beginning of this time. Where are we after that video? Where are we right now? I know I saw in the chat, some people said feeling hopeless. I know some people said they're afraid. Some people said they feel hopeful. Some people felt different ways. And this visual I like, and this is pretty much my last slide. But let's talk about where we are in these zones, right? I think it's pretty self-explanatory. How do we feel about this visual in terms of where we are, where we were when we started this conversation versus where we are now, where we'd like to be?
I feel like it's helpful to name that it's not always like moving quickly from one section to the other in a linear, but I'm often like going back and coming forward and moving all around.
Every single day. And thank you for naming that. I admit to everybody, I'm always nervous when I start. I'm probably somewhere in the fear zone, literally every single time I start this conversation. And not because I don't believe in this work. It's like I'm talking to a new group every day, and I don't know how open people are going to be to this. You know, sure, I got that. I mean, that's the real secret behind why my hair is always colorful, because if I come in and I'm colorful, then maybe they'll forget that we're coming in to talk about serious stuff, because it's scary. So the fear zone can be one day, I feel like I'm in a growth zone tomorrow, or a learning zone. So absolutely. Anything else?
Yes, I definitely agree. It's sort of like a back and forth. It's like I feel like I'm growing, and then I see implicit bias play out in a lot of situations,
Every day.
just like coming, just like my thoughts being in the wrong place and being like, no, Peyton, no, like that's implicit. Like you can't think like that. So I'm like starting to restructure how I think. So.
And even then you'll still run into it. I don't, were you there? Did you do the implicit bias training last month?
Yes, I did. It was amazing. It was so good.
It was
very
and
important.
The part I love is it's close to the end where she does where it's like the red, yellow, green, blue, whatever, that part. And we literally spent 45 minutes talking about implicit bias and which part of your brain you're using and all of that. Spent 45 minutes. And immediately when we do that activity, it's like, wait, how did I do that? Like, so it happens. And just giving yourself grace, right? Like,
what part of that brain would that come from?
Absolutely. Giving yourself as much grace as possible, because that doesn't make you a bad person. That's why I'm not a fan of using that language anyway. What is harmful isn't the initial, especially when you're talking about implicit bias. What is harmful isn't the thought, right? Like, because it happens. We have I think it's like 11 million thoughts a minute or something huge like that. It's not stopping. It's acting on these biases and not questioning them. So it'll happen. I do it all the time. And I like to make sure people know that I do it too. I teach about it, but I do it too because I'm busy. I got a lot of things going on. My brain is in I operate from that side of my brain probably all the time. Half the things my teenage son says to me, I'm like, yeah, sure, yeah, great, sure. It's a pandemic outside, right? So, oh, sorry, I'm easily distracted because I'm looking at the chat too. But yes, I have to give yourself grace. Is that's the word of the game. As long as you're trying and as long as you're growing and going for resources and asking questions and continuing these conversations, it is a up and down and back and forth. Emily, your question about the video. Are we recording, Felicia? She is recording?
Yes, I am.
Oh, good. So yes. Then, yes. The video from the beginning of the training. I read that wrong. Okay, yes. That and I'm also gonna give you all a PDF of this PowerPoint because some of these things are linked and there are additional articles and stuff in there. So we can continue using this visual as a place of questions, but if there are any other questions, because I don't like to take up the whole amount of time talking and and giving information, because to really make sure that we have really gotten out of this, what you needed out of this presentation, I like to give enough time for some good questions. Are there any other questions that folks have in general? Comments, concerns, anything that starts with C, because I like alliteration. How can we, okay. I think I can give you that link.
Nubia, I would like to ask the question of, for those of us who are, I think all of us are working in some sort of nonprofit organization or some type of organization, in doing anti-racist work, there's always what I have found in all of the trainings that I've been through over the years is there's a lot of focus on that, doing that internal work and educating yourself. But then when it comes to that actual practice, that daily practice of not just challenging those biases that come up and challenging ourselves, but how, that question of how do we actually do this work? And I feel like there's not a lot of talk about how to do that in practice. And, I'm trying to find those resources, but also just thinking, I think for me, where I have started is really looking at the ways, like using the knowledge and education that I've gained so far, and really looking at the ways that white supremacy plays out in our systems and in our policies and our procedures.
Absolutely.
In our organization. So not just like looking at the racial makeup of our organizations, but like when we think about hiring people, and this is, I think, hiring practices and how we support employees, that is probably one of the biggest areas where we can do anti-racist work and see a big impact. And so I don't know if you have any advice or knowledge that you would like to share with us, but I know for myself, that's where I'm trying to start in doing this work as a program director. But I don't, so that's my kind of like question. Or
no, that's a really good question, because that question actually comes up a lot, and I could always take it back to the philosophical level, but like when I think about our emphasis on specialty, right? Like in these structures, like all of us are like specialists. We think about doctors. There are not enough general practitioners. There are enough cardiologists. There are enough anesthesiologists. And so it's hard to see the sum, right? That we are really the sum of all the parts. So what happens? So a couple of things are happening at the same time. The cool thing is everybody's talking about anti-racism and that people have been studying anti-racism work for a really long time. The thing is that because it wasn't recognized until more recently, published, we're used to a manual on all of this stuff. So and part of, decolonizing how we do this work in specialties is looking at what other organizations are doing. Not other organizations. There's a lot of research around what community centers have done to build communities. Because I know that you are, you're learning history. You're super interested in history. I mean, this is just a little advice, since you're looking at how to decolonize what's happening in your spaces with LYG, for example, looking at practices that community centers use for majority Black populations. Because what we know about history of community centers, they happened, Black and Brown community centers specifically, happened as a result of Black Panther work, right? So, because it had to come from the community, because it wasn't like government agencies were like too slow. It wasn't happening, right? So they were like, we got to do this for ourselves. So looking at practices that were solidified through community centers, and then following that back, you could follow that back to the Black Power movement if you want. But if you're just looking for practices, I know context, everybody don't got time to read histories. I get it. But that's where that comes from. But those practices in Black and Brown communities prior to the 80s, because we know that when governments decided, oh, this is actually a good way to give services through community centers. So they incorporated all the red tape and stuff. But back then there was still money too. So what came with the red tape was money, right? But we know after the 80s, if you see New Jack City and you know what happened in the 80s with Reagan and everything else, what we know is that we still got red tape for nonprofits and community centers and stuff like that, and no money. But there were practices that were happening in those affirming spaces. And because I know you're interested in intersectional liberation work, looking at what other what organizations are doing around creating space for LGBT plus, communities in spaces that weren't traditionally that are doing well. You can literally be transdisciplinary and looking at practices that way. So there may not be practices on how to make all these spaces anti-racist. And I think that's a mistake that we make in terms of thinking like, I need this word and I need this practice. That's what we're trying to do, is be super specific. But these practices have been happening across all marginalized identities, and we're all people. This is when we take away the race piece, if you know what I mean, at least in the research side of it, and pulling from those practices because they still work. You're just changing who you're doing them for, kind of, sort of. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? So community centers is a good place to start. Since I know you all do a lot of methods training with Metro United Way, y'all, that's what y'all come here for. one of the things I used to do when I used to work in the mayor's office with the youth implementation team, because I had a lot of Black and brown students, and my framework was social justice youth development. And when I tell you, there is a whole reading list of practices that are happening, and that was helpful. It was extremely helpful. And I know that you all do the methods training, and I love those green books that we used to. I don't know if you've been doing this work long enough to get the green books from the trainings. I don't know. Felicia knows what I'm talking about. But I would pair those activities and with research. If you're big on doing research and stuff like that, look up social justice youth development, especially for those of you who are working specifically with young people like every day in your spaces. They pair very well together. And that's anti-racist practices that are intersectional for staff, because people are people, right? But also, so if you're training staff, you're utilizing the same methodology for training staff and creating welcoming spaces for staff the same way you are for young people, the young people that you serve. So that's two things: looking up community centers, looking at what other marginalized population. There's three things actually. Looking what other places are doing for marginalized populations that have a longer history of recording what they're doing in an official capacity, since we're, told to only go for what's published, but we know what the history of publishing. But then also looking up social justice youth development. Just look it up. And literally, I have a 3-page long reading list that someone sent to me, and it's like my Bible. And if I can find it, I'll send it to Felicia. But definitely there are practices that are happening. That's why history is so important, because that stuff is there. That was a long answer to a short question. Sorry about that. Good. Anyone else?
Jump in real quick. And maybe I heard M's question just a smidge differently, and I could be completely off base, but as more organizations are looking to be anti-racist, and they really want to diversify their staff and how they do things and their practices, that's something that we are looking at as far as helping our programs. And as senior manager of program development, that's something that I can help you with in terms of brainstorming ways to find additional staffing, especially a more diverse, right? Most time your folks invite their friends to apply. And if they're white, generally their friends are white, and therefore quality employees, but they generally, are homogeneous, right? So just thinking about reach out to me. We can set up a time and we can chat. The other LSHRM, Louisville's SHRM group, has been really looking and leaning into this as well. So that's another, the good folks at LSHRM can, lend their expertise as well, because they get this question consistently, and they are really actively looking at helping provide guidance, and they've come up with a lot of information as well, and so they can be most helpful. But reach out to me and we can absolutely figure out how to help out with this.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Felicia. That's another thing. Understanding what other people are doing around you, because I can guarantee you that somebody's working on that, right? Because it's almost been like, in some ways, anti-racism work has been an underground movement, literally and figuratively, I guess. But there are folks that have, I tell people I'm not the expert, but I read enough to connect you to somebody that knows something. And I think that the more we lean into that, the less stressful this can be. I mean, it's going to always be stressful, but doing this work will be less stressful, because again, this idea of understanding what other people around you are doing, so you know what is yours to do, is less daunting. So you don't have to create a whole new hiring practice. That's the cool part. You just got to be at the table and implement. That is your job. And it helps you understand after you've done like you're resourceful, as you seek out these resources, then it's clearer for you. It allows you to take care of yourself better, because you're like, that's above my pay grade, because I don't understand what's happening. And I don't literally mean above your pay grade, because none of us are getting paid what we need to be getting paid to do this hard work. But I mean, when I say that, I mean, you understand what's happening around you and what belongs to you to do really, really well. So you'll take care of yourself and you'll be like, y'all need to be clearer here. Y'all need more information. If y'all gonna make me do this, then y'all need to let me do this and lean into community. So leaning into the community that's around you is a huge resource for sure. And look at that, y'all done already made the connection there. So that's great. That leads me to my, and of course I'm still sticking around for questions too, but I don't know how many of you watched the inauguration. I figured I was in friendly territory that most of us probably did. I usually end my presentation with the whole poem, but I was like, maybe I'm doing too much because I would do it every single time. But when I think about this work, I really am drawn to the last part of Amanda Gorman's poem that she did for the inauguration. I mean, the whole thing was fabulous, but where she says that when the day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light if we are brave enough to see it, if we're only brave enough to be it. And I say this because our greatest resource among all of us, well, two things actually, is community, absolutely, and bravery. Because this is really scary. And I like to think about this for anyone with a privileged identity, because again, liberation is intersectional. Anyone with any level of privilege in any parts of their identity, it's really scary to be forced to reckon with that. But the solution to that is bravery. And the best leaders, and I think in general, best managers, best directors, best anybody that I've worked for or with, they didn't ever have to know everything. The best ones were brave. I mean, they were kind, but they were brave. And because this is really hard work, no matter where you're sitting. So our best resource is each other and bravery. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm done. And but like I said, I'll stick around if anybody else has any questions. But I appreciate y'all for listening and sitting around and let me rattle off a bunch of stuff that I just been reading for a really long time.
Before people jump, this is really important. We have this series has been called Equity as a Foundational Approach. And we are really trying to figure out if this is something that's helpful to people in terms of should we keep going with this work? So I am going to launch a poll. Once you answer, please feel free to stay on or you can get off, but it's really, really important. I can't talk to the powers that be about continuing the work unless I know if there's a need for it. And being honest, don't think I just want you to say this because if you want it, we will continue it. But, if you feel like you're more so in that growth stage and you are where you need to be and, this is overdone, let us know that as well. But if you want it, I can set up additional trainings, but I just need to make sure, that this is helpful. So before you jump, please, 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 and please click on the poll. Yes or no. I'm not offended either way.
Me either. I'm not offended either.
So yeah, this isn't about this. This is not about today. This is about, do you want this to continue, April, May, next fall, if this is something, would you be interested in? Do you want to keep it going? So yeah, so everybody on the call, please, please, please. I see some folks haven't voted yet. Please vote. Like I said,
Felicia?
Yes.
If it's helpful and for, if you have the opportunity to pass this on to the powers that be, as you said, I think this is absolutely essential because if it wasn't for Nubia and Marian, I wouldn't have anybody to talk to about this stuff except for maybe my wife and my friends who very quickly get annoyed with me and are like, you just got white guilt, Aaron, and all this stuff. And so, yeah, I think is like, it's relevant to us because we're all with youth development, but it's like, yeah, these conversations are really, really hard. I have a really hard time broaching the subject with people. And so I think that it's great doing it as a monthly thing. And I would love to see more opportunities. And even if it's just like, if there's some way to do a discussion type thing every few months, just to like a roundtable, that would be great. So thank you. Yeah, 100%.
Yay.
Cool.
That's awesome. I'm going to ask everybody to do this as well, right? So I'm thinking of a specific topic for April. Got to figure it out, all of those kind of things. But I invite you, don't just come to these for yourself, for your own personal growth. I'm sure that there are folks that you work with, whether they're your superiors or your colleagues or your subordinates, whoever they are. I'm encouraging you to tell somebody else, invite somebody else, say, hey, this is going on, send it to everybody you work with and everybody you know. Because these are right now, they're free, right? They're free and open to the public. And if you're getting value from this and growth and learning and feeling more comfortable, somebody else probably needs this. And if it's not, if you just have the information yourself, you won't have anybody to chat with. But if you're inviting people into the conversation, we could have had 100 folks on this call today. At the height of it, there were 47 people on the call. That's half of where we could be, right? And so if at some point we get to be 200 people deep in here, that's awesome. I will, but we want to bring folks along so that we all can be anti-racist and we all want to walk this and grow together. So we may be babies right now, but we're going to become toddlers, and then we're going to become, little kindergartners, right? We have a ways to go. We're always learning. Don't feel like this is, we're all family. If anybody wants to chat with Aaron about this later, he told you where he works. I'm sure he'll be willing to chat back and forth through email. And because this is the work that we're doing. We're all trying to be the best that we can be. Does that work with everybody? All right, so I'm going to invite everybody. Perfect. Thank you, Aaron. Aaron's email is in the chat. Write it down. Before we leave, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Nubia, for today. Thank you for everybody being engaged and, really being transparent about, none of us have arrived, right? Thank you, M. M has shared as well. Look in the chat, chat with people, talk to folks. Let's let this become a community. Let's grow together. Let's learn together. We talked about the person who had the video at the very beginning, right? Kimberly Jones, right? There's another person that I have in mind who can further this conversation. So I'm going to invite you to it. I'm going to put it together, invite you to it for late April. Please, please, please tell everybody you know so that we can all learn together and move together. Are there any questions?
Are you ready to share what you think that topic will be yet?
I have found Sean Rochester. I'm always looking at, and Sean Rochester wrote The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And I think for a lot of folks, it's like, oh, there's no issue going on. Sean really explains, do you know that it's most likely I pay more in taxes on my house than you do? Right? There are costs associated with being Black versus being anything else, right? And Sean outlines it in the book called The Black Tax, and also has this conversation in terms of, this is what it is. This is how it presents on the job. So if you're trying to make a more welcoming environment for a diverse hire, these are some things to keep in mind, because I know we want to do well, but if the culture is off, they're still not going to stay. right? And this is what you can do immediately going forward. If you put these things into play, this is how you can help move the train forward. So that's the person that I would love to bring to you all. Don't know yet availability or that sort of thing, but if not, there are so many other things. Nubia does microaggressions. There's some more folks who are doing great work in the space. But I wanted to make sure that this is something that was needed before I, started planning dates and that sort of thing, right? So I appreciate you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking time with me. I apologize, we're about 4 minutes over, but thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. If you need me for anything, email me, felicia.young@metrounitedway.org. Call me 502-292-6112, and we can chat, we can email, you can set up time. So if you have any emails from me, in my signature stamp, there's a place where you can set up time to chat with me. All right, thank you all. Thank you all. Nubia, do you have anything else? Awesome. Look for
I'm good.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Look for an invitation next week on the trainings in early April, and I'll get a late April equity as a foundational approach training set up, probably for the last week in April. Thank you all.